My mom said, "We're only inviting you out of pity, so don't stay long." I just smiled, took a sip of my drink, and quietly left. 2 weeks later, they found out I'd sold the family cabin they all counted on for summer vacations. Then the bank statements started arriving. Their joint accounts were closed, the property taxes were unpaid, and a lawyer's letter was on its way. "We're only inviting you out of pity, so don't stay too long." The words hit me as I set down my glass, the echo of my mother's voice, sharp and casual, cutting through the hum of clinking glasses and polite laughter. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her, that perhaps the music and the dull roar of conversation had twisted her words. But then my sister's laugh rang out, a quick, sharp sound like a judge's gavel coming down, and I knew I'd heard right. My mother leaned in close, her perfectly manicured hand resting on the back of my sister's chair, her diamond bracelet catching the light from the chandelier. She was already turning back to the group, dismissing me as casually as if she just swatted away an annoying fly. I felt my brother's wife's eyes on me, that smug, sideways look she always gave me, as if sizing me up and finding me lacking. My brother, his arms slung possessively over her shoulder, grinned and took another sip of his expensive scotch, his watch flashing in the dim light. They were all in on it, every one of them. I just smiled and took a slow, deliberate sip of my whiskey, letting the warmth spread down my throat. I didn't bother to answer. What was the point? I had heard those little digs all my life, felt the condescension simmering beneath their perfectly curated small talk. It used to bother me, back when I thought I could earn their respect, or at least their acceptance. But that ship had sailed a long time ago. I set my glass down on the polished mahogany bar and glanced around the room. The house was just as I remembered it, all tasteful furniture and carefully chosen artwork, every nook and cranny a reflection of my parents' carefully cultivated image. It had once felt like home, but now it felt like a museum I had wandered into by mistake. I left without a word, slipping out the side door into the cold night air, my footsteps echoing off the stone path that led to the driveway. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, probably another group text from my sister or a last-minute reminder about a cousin's birthday. I ignored it and slid into my car, gripping the cold leather of the steering wheel. As I drove away, the bitterness of my mother's words settled into a slow, simmering anger. But there was something else underneath. A kind of clarity. They thought I was the black sheep, the family failure. Fine. I'd play that role if they wanted me to, but on my terms. I was tired of being the butt of their jokes, the afterthought at every family gathering, the one they could dismiss with a sneer and a tight, condescending smile. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my apartment, a plan had already begun to form in the back of my mind. Something slow and meticulous, the kind of long game that would unravel their perfectly planned lives one thread at a time. The next morning I called Dan, my attorney. It was early, but he owed me a favor. We'd closed a tricky real estate deal a few years back, and I knew he'd be up for the kind of quiet, ruthless work I had in mind. When he answered, his voice groggy and slightly annoyed, I just smiled. "Hey Dan. Remember that family dacha my parents put in my name years ago? I think it's time to make some changes." I didn't waste any time. The morning after the party, I woke up with a headache, but it wasn't from the whiskey. It was the echo of my mother's words, the smug laughter of my siblings, the tight, condescending smiles they threw my way as if they had me all figured out. Pity. That's how they felt about me. Like I was some family charity case they were dragging around to make themselves feel better. I got out of bed, splashed some cold water on my face, and sat down at my kitchen table, its small, scratched surface covered with a mixture of yesterday's junk mail and an old coffee ring I'd never bothered to wipe off. I grabbed a notebook and a pen, the same one I used to scribble notes on freelance projects, and started making a list. Not a rant. No childish revenge fantasy. I was past that. This was a plan. Cold, calculated, and long overdue. The first item I wrote down in big, sharp letters, sell the dacha. I had almost forgotten about it. The family dacha, a cozy 2-story cabin on a lake about 2 hours outside of town, left to me by my grandparents. It had been a special place when I was a kid, full of summer memories, fishing trips with my grandfather, campfires that crackled late into the night, the sweet, smoky taste of charred marshmallows. But my parents had quietly taken control of it years ago, treating it like their personal summer retreat, a place for family barbecues and long weekends with friends, while I was rarely even invited. They used it without a second thought, just as they used me as the punchline to their family jokes. But the title was in my name, a fact I had mostly ignored out of a misplaced sense of family loyalty. I found my lawyer Dan's number and hit call. He answered on the third ring, his voice rough and groggy, as if I'd pulled him out of a deep sleep. "Tom, what's going on? It's not even 8 a.m. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the gray light filtering through my thin apartment blinds. "I want to sell the dacha. The one my grandparents left me." There was a pause, and I could practically hear him frowning on the other end. "The family place? The one out on Lake Marlowe? I thought your parents used it." I felt a small, bitter smile creep across my face. "They are. But the title is in my name, and I'm done letting them treat it like their personal vacation spot. I want it sold. Quickly." Dan hesitated, probably weighing whether to push back. He knew my family, had been to some of our gatherings back when I was still trying to keep up appearances. He understood the dynamics, the subtle jabs, the power plays. "All right," he said finally, his tone changing to something more professional, more focused. "I can make it happen. We need to do this quietly if you don't want them to get wind of it before it's too late." "That's the plan," I replied, already pulling open the old metal filing cabinet next to my desk. I dug through the folders, flipping through old tax returns and utility bills until I found what I was looking for: the original deed, the yellowed, slightly crumpled paper still carrying the faint, comforting smell of cedar from my grandparents' old chest. I spent the rest of the morning scanning documents, double-checking paperwork, and signing everything Dan sent my way. I wanted this done before my family had a chance to blink. I imagined them pulling up to the dacha in midsummer with their SUVs full of coolers and lawn chairs, only to find a new family on the porch, waving politely as they unloaded their own belongings. In the afternoon, Dan texted me. "Got everything. I'll list it tomorrow. Sure you're ready for the fallout?" I grinned, staring at the words on my cracked phone screen. Ready for the fallout? They had no idea what I was planning. I put the phone down, leaned back in my creaking chair, and let the satisfaction of this first step wash over me. This wasn't just about the money, although that would be a nice bonus. This was about shaking the foundation of their perfectly polished world, making them realize they couldn't keep writing me off like some family joke. I picked up my pen and scribbled the next item on my list, the one that would really send a shockwave through their tightly woven lives: joint accounts. This was only the beginning. Selling the dacha was the first crack, but I wanted to make sure the whole structure came crashing down. I had spent too many years as the quiet, overlooked outsider, the one they barely tolerated out of a twisted sense of familial obligation. It was time to stop being their punchline. After sending off the dacha paperwork, I sat down to tackle the next piece of my plan: the joint accounts. My parents had been using my name for years, slipping me into various financial arrangements without a second thought, treating me like a convenient extra signature when it suited them. It had started while I was still in college: a co-signed car loan here, a shared utility bill there, little things they'd insisted were just for convenience. Of course, they'd never mentioned that some of those accounts still existed. But I remembered every phone call I'd gotten from the bank over the years, every piece of mail they'd accidentally forwarded to my tiny apartment. And if there was one thing I had learned from my family, it was that money was their true love language. I spent a good hour digging through old emails and bank statements, piecing together a rough picture of my parents' financial habits. It didn't take long to figure out that some of their joint accounts still had my name on them, and more than that, some of the accounts tied to the dacha's utilities and property taxes were also in my name. It was all the leverage I needed. I called Dan again. "Hey, it's me," I said when he picked up. "I need you to dig a little deeper. I want to know exactly which accounts still have my name on them, and I want them closed. All of them." Dan let out a low whistle. "You're really going for the jugular, huh? All right, I can pull the records. This could get messy." "Messy's fine," I replied, leaning back in my chair and tapping my thumb on the edge of my desk in a slow, contented rhythm. "Just make sure it hits them where it hurts." Over the next week, I watched the wheels begin to turn. Bank notifications began to trickle in, little digital pings that marked the slow, methodical unraveling of her financial web. First came the joint checking account my mother had quietly kept open in both of our names, a holdover from a forgotten car purchase years ago. Dan closed it without a second thought, transferring the balance to my personal account. It wasn't much, maybe a few $100s, but it was a start. Then came the property taxes on the dacha. Without my signature on the account, the automatic withdrawals bounced, triggering a series of increasingly frantic emails from my parents, which I dutifully ignored. 2 days later, my brother texted me, his message short and dripping with the thinly disguised superiority he always exuded. "Hey, Mom and Dad say some of the accounts aren't working. Did you do something? Call them." I left it unread. I pictured them sitting around their spotless dining room table, the carefully arranged family photos looking down on them like silent, judgmental witnesses. I imagined my mother, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping impatiently on her phone, my father leaning back in his leather chair, his face tightening as he realized how much control he had lost. I leaned back in my own chair, a thin smile stretching across my face as I wrote the next line on my growing list: call the lawyer about the will. They had started this war, but I intended to finish it. After the accounts were closed and the dacha paperwork was signed, I felt the tide begin to turn. I imagined my parents sitting in their immaculate living room, my mother clutching her phone, my father's jaw tightening with each bounce payment notice. I knew them well enough to imagine the scene the way they'd whisper sharply to each other, my mother's voice rising, my father trying to maintain control, his temper simmering just below the surface. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more card to play, one they wouldn't see coming. The will. I had never given it much thought. I figured whatever they had would be divided among us kids, with my brother getting the lion's share as the golden boy of the family. But after the party, after the dacha and the accounts, I realized I had a chance to level the playing field a bit. Maybe even tilt it in my favor. I dug through my emails and found the contact information for the family's estate lawyer, a gray-haired shark of a man named Harris. He had been my father's lawyer for years, a fixture at every family event, quietly nodding along as my parents bragged about their investments and my brother's latest career triumphs. I had always found him slightly intimidating, with his perfectly tailored suits and thin, disapproving stare. But I knew he had a keen sense of self-preservation, the kind of lawyer who would drop a client in a heartbeat if it meant avoiding trouble. I called him the next morning, my coffee still steaming on the counter. He picked up on the second ring, his tone brisk and professional. "Tom, what can I do for you?" I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching a couple of pigeons pecking at crumbs on the fire escape outside my window. "I want to talk about the will. The family estate. I want to make sure everything is in order." There was a pause, just long enough for me to imagine him sitting up straighter, the creak of his expensive leather chair echoing in his office. "Is there a particular concern you have, Tom?" he asked carefully, his tone shifting slightly, as if trying to figure out if this was just a routine check or the beginning of a legal minefield. "I just want to make sure my interests are protected," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost bored. "You know, in case there are any surprises down the road." He hesitated, and I could almost hear the mental gears turning. Harris was a professional, a man who thrived on controlling narratives and managing family drama, but I could feel the unease creeping into his voice. "I'd like to set up a meeting," he finally said. "We can go over everything and make sure your rights are clear." "Perfect," I replied, a small satisfied smile spreading across my face. "Let's do that." I hung up, feeling a strange, electric thrill run through me. I was no longer the passive, overlooked son, the afterthought of the family. I was turning their carefully constructed world upside down, one calculated move at a time. That night I got a text from my sister. "Mom's freaking out. What's wrong with the dacha? Call me." I left it unread, my smile growing as I poured myself a drink. I pictured them, the tight circle of my family, frantically trying to piece together what was happening, their carefully laid plans unraveling faster than they could patch them together. They had sidelined me for years, dismissing me as the black sheep, the family failure. But now they were finally beginning to understand what happens when you corner someone and push them too far. I sat back and let the sharp, bitter taste of whiskey linger on my tongue. This was only the beginning. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout to begin. 2 days after my call with Harris, I received a series of frantic voicemails from my mother, her voice strained, each message a little more desperate than the last. The first was carefully controlled, her words clipped and sharp. "Tom, this is your mother. We need to talk about the dacha. Call me as soon as you get this." The second, a few hours later, had a slight tremor. "Tom, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is getting out of hand. You can't just sell the dacha without talking to us. Call me back. Please." By the third message, her composure had completely broken down. "Tom, this is ridiculous. You have to call me." This isn't just your decision. We're family. I let her sit, the red notification bubble on my phone growing with each passing hour, each ignored call adding fuel to the fire. Then my brother tried. He called 3 times before finally sending a blunt, angry text. "What the hell are you doing, Tom? You're screwing everything up. Call Mom. Now." I leaned back in my chair and sipped my coffee as I read his message again. It felt good to see the cracks begin to form, to know that my carefully placed pressure points were beginning to hit home. Later that afternoon, Dan sent me a quick text update. "Offer came in on the dacha. Strong. Cash buyer. I'm moving forward." I responded with a simple, "Do it." As the day wore on, I could almost feel the chaos building across town, my family struggling to regain control of a situation they didn't realize they were losing until it was too late. Late that night, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline and shadows crept across the walls of my apartment, my door buzzer went off, a harsh, angry sound echoing through the quiet hallway. I set down my glass and walked to the intercom, half expecting one of my neighbors to complain about the loud music coming from the apartment below. But when I pressed the button, my brother's voice crackled through the small speaker. "Open up, Tom. We need to talk." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the button, my mind racing through the possible outcomes. But I had come this far. There was no point in backing down now. I called him in and left the door slightly ajar, the old hinges creaking as I stepped back and crossed my arms, waiting. A few moments later, my brother walked in, his face flushed, his jaw set, the tension rolling off him in waves. He glanced around my small, cluttered apartment, his nose wrinkling slightly, as if the mismatched furniture and overflowing bookshelves were a personal affront. He closed the door behind him with a sharp click and turned to me, eyes narrowed. "What the hell's going on, Tom?" I leaned back against the wall and crossed my arms, my expression calm. "I'm not sure what you mean." He let out a harsh, humorless laugh and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Don't play dumb. The dacha. The accounts. Mom's been going crazy for days. She's talking about hiring a lawyer." I shrugged, the movement slow and deliberate. "She can if she wants to, but the dacha is in my name. Always has been." His face tightened, a muscle in his jaw twitching. "This place is for the family, Tom. You can't just sell it out from under us." I met his gaze, my own eyes cold. "Funny, I don't remember anyone asking my opinion when they used it for years without even telling me. Never heard anyone complain then." He took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment I thought he might actually take a swing at me, but then he just let out a frustrated growl, turned on his heel and paced the small living room, his eyes sweeping over the old sagging couch, the crooked picture frames on the wall, the chipped coffee table stacked with old magazines. He turned back to me, his voice deep and sharp. "What do you want, Tom? Money? Is that it? Just tell me what this is about and maybe we can work something out." I felt a slow, bitter smile spread across my face. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about money. It's about respect. Something none of you have ever given me." He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off, my voice rising for the first time. "You all wrote me off a long time ago. Treated me like the family embarrassment, the failure. But you forgot one thing." He paused, his eyes narrowing, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. "I still have a piece of this family," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm taking back what's mine." For a long, heavy moment, we just stared at each other, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Finally, he turned away, muttering something as he reached for the door handle. He yanked it open, the old wood creaking in protest, and stalked out without another word, the door slamming behind him. I let out a slow breath, the adrenaline slowly draining from my veins, and poured myself another drink. They wanted a black sheep? Fine. I'd show them exactly what it looked like. A week after my brother's unannounced visit, the real chaos began. I woke up to a series of notifications on my phone: missed calls, frantic texts, a couple of barely coherent voicemails. It felt like the digital version of an alarm bell, a signal that the pressure I'd been building had finally reached its breaking point. I rolled out of bed, rubbed my eyes, and checked my messages. First was a text from my sister. "Mom's freaking out. Call me. Now." Then another, a few minutes later. "What did you do? Dad's talking about cutting you off completely. Seriously, call me." I grinned and set my phone down on the kitchen counter as I started my coffee. I had expected the backlash, the desperate scramble to patch up their perfect family image. But this was happening faster than I'd hoped. As the coffee dripped into the pot, filling the small kitchen with its bitter aroma, I pulled up my email and found a message from Dan. Dacha sale closed. Funds transferred. Nice chunk of change. Call me when you get a chance. I leaned back against the counter, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across my face. They hadn't even noticed it was gone yet. I grabbed my coffee, took a long, slow sip, and finally hit play on my mother's latest voicemail. Her voice crackled through the speaker, high and tense, a note of panic I hadn't heard from her in years. Tom, this has gone far enough. I don't know what you're getting at, but this is ridiculous. The dacha is ours, it's for the family, and you had no right to sell it without talking to us. Call me back. Now. I hung up the phone, the voicemail still ringing in my ears. She sounded scared, genuinely panicked, a crack in her usually unflappable facade. Then, just as I was about to take another sip of my coffee, the door buzzer went off. I froze, the cup halfway to my lips, my heart doing a quick, startled lurch. I set the cup down, crossed the small living room, and pressed the intercom button. Yes? It's Dad. Open up. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the door release. I hadn't seen my father in months, not since a tense, uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner where he'd spent the entire meal talking about my brother's latest business deal and my sister's perfect children. But I invited him in. This was a confrontation I had been expecting, and part of me was almost looking forward to it. Moments later, the door swung open and my father stepped in, his eyes sharp, his jaw set. He took a quick, judgmental look around my small apartment, his gaze sweeping over the mismatched furniture, the cluttered bookshelf, the pile of unopened mail on the counter. He closed the door behind him, the sharp click echoing in the silence. We need to talk, he said, his tone low and measured, the voice of a man used to being in control. I crossed my arms and leaned back against the wall, my expression calm. All right. Talk. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. What the hell do you think you're doing? Selling the dacha? Cutting us off from the accounts? You've made a big mistake, Tom. I met his gaze and refused to flinch. No, Dad. The mistake was treating me like I didn't matter for years. Like I was just some afterthought, some screw-up that you had to tolerate. I'm just correcting that. His jaw tightened, a muscle jerking in his cheek. This is about money, isn't it? You want a bigger piece of the inheritance? Is that what this is? I let out a short, bitter laugh. You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about money. This is about respect. About not being the family punching bag anymore. For a long, tense moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us thick and suffocating. Finally, he broke eye contact, his shoulders slumping slightly, the fire in his eyes dying, as if he had finally realized how badly he had miscalculated. All right, he said quietly, his voice tinged with a bitterness I hadn't heard before. You've made your point. I straightened, my pulse quickening. No, I'm just getting started. He turned without another word, yanked the door open, and stepped out into a hallway, the door slamming behind him with a sharp, final bang. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. I felt a strange, unexpected calm settle over me, a deep, satisfying sense of control I hadn't felt in years. As I walked back to the kitchen to finish my coffee, my phone buzzed again. Another text from my sister, then one from my brother. The messages were shorter now, less demanding, almost nervous. Let's talk. We can work this out. Mom wants to apologize. Just call her. I took another slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, bitter taste, and set the cup down with a satisfied clink. They had underestimated me. Dismissed me. Written me off as the black sheep. But now, for the first time in years, I felt like I had finally taken my place in the family, on my own terms. And if they wanted my forgiveness, my cooperation, my respect, they'd have to earn it.